A few years ago, a scandal destroyed my career. I was forced to disappear from the media. Today, I have collected archives and testimonies that show who really started the rumors. I feel free, and I want you to hear the whole truth. My career was torn apart by lies. They thought I was gone for good, but I'm back to show who planted the poison. Years ago, I stood under bright lights and smiling cameras, woven into a narrative someone else wrote. I was praised, then accused, then erased. A scandal bloomed overnight. Whispers, doctored messages, a leaked photo twisted out of context. Colleagues I trusted became actors in a play they didn't know they were in. Friends turned away. My inbox filled with threats and cold congratulations. In the span of a week, everything I had built, reputation, partnerships, small routines of daily pride, crumbled. The headlines carved a hollow where my life used to be. I remember the particular cold of walking into a coffee shop and feeling 50 faces turn away from a name that had once opened doors. At first I believed in being reasonable. Release statements, request retractions, plead my case privately. Each time I knocked, the door closed with a new rumor propped in the frame. Wait, they'd say, we're looking into it, which translated to, we are protecting the people who made the story. The legal team moved like molasses, and the PR people who once took my calls now forwarded them to assistants with unreadable tones. Behind the scenes, I started to see patterns. A laugh shared in a group chat, a forwarded file with a note that should never have left an inbox. The pieces pointed to a familiar face. Those who profited from my fall were those who had wanted my seat, my contracts, my influence. The desire for revenge didn't flare immediately. It took root quietly, like frost under a leaf. The development of my plan required patience and exactness. Revenge for me would be truthful, measured, and cold as a scalpel. I collected everything: old emails, time-stamped edits, backup copies of audio that contradicted public statements, and a series of memos forwarded between executives on a thread that conveniently misplaced my clarifications. I reached out to a few people who still had integrity left. A junior IT analyst who once admired my work dug into server logs and found what the PR firm had scrubbed. A former assistant, who had been coerced into deleting messages, kept a printed copy in a shoebox and, with trembling hands, agreed to speak. I learned to wait, to let the investigators move when they thought the trail had gone cold. I rehearsed how to present evidence so that it couldn't be dismissed as the desperate work of a disgraced person. The goal wasn't to destroy, at least not for its own sake, but to reveal, slowly, the architecture of the lie. There were dramatic pauses in the plan by design. I created a rhythm they didn't anticipate. A small leak here, a corroborating message there, each one timed to appear where it would cause the maximum ripple with minimal exposure. I used irony as a tool, posting ceaseless transparency in a space engineered for obfuscation. My forensics friend created visual timelines. My journalist ally prepared questions that would corner the deniers into contradictions on live broadcasts. The receptionist passed me scanned memos that proved coordination. I felt like an orchestra conductor, tapping silence with my baton while the instruments of truth warmed up. Somewhere in the quiet between maneuvers, I allowed myself to imagine the faces that would shift when the wind finally turned. The moment of climax arrived not as a cinematic explosion, but as a surgical unmasking. I published a short, surgical statement on the platform where their brand managers fed on fast attention. A few years ago, a scandal destroyed my career. I had to disappear from the media. Today I have compiled archives and testimonies that show who actually started the rumors. I feel free, and I want you to hear the whole truth. It was simple, almost annoyingly polite. It fit the cadence of a comeback they expected to be contrived. But beneath that sentence lay a packet of evidence with timestamps, internal chats, and a chain of command that led straight to the people who had smiled beside me at award ceremonies while sliding the knife between my ribs. As the live stream began, the first audible reaction came from the PR director whose name was in 2 of the damning threads. He went pale on camera while reading public denials that no longer aligned with the logged messages I presented. Board members who had previously floated ambiguous statements were forced into clarity as transcripts scrolled on screen. I watched, removed and precise, as a CEO's practiced smile faltered into a cough that would be replayed in private group chats for weeks. The architects of the smear tried to spin, then to preempt, then to attack the messenger. Predictable steps in a choreography I had already accounted for. When a key intern, now a whistleblower, read an apology live, the silence that followed was thicker than any applause I had ever received. The aftermath felt uncanny. Social feeds split into camps. Those who cheered the exposure of corruption, those who recoiled at the spectacle of revenge, and those who watched with the casual hunger of viewers waiting for the next season. Investigations were opened, legal letters flew, people I loved sent messages with a new, tentative warmth. And still, in the quiet hours, the victory tasted strange. There was satisfaction, not the terrible, burning kind, but the clear-edged kind that comes when a ledger is balanced and the books finally close. I had wanted not merely to be believed, but to unmask the mechanism that allowed belief to be stolen. In doing so, I had to become as methodical as the people who had plotted my fall. The finale was not a shout, but an archive. I curated the documents and deposited them with an independent investigator whose integrity outweighed their taste for clicks. I handed over the rest to a reporter who resisted sensationalism. I deleted accounts that had been poisoned with other people's lies and started again on platforms that didn't know my past. There was a domesticity to the conclusion. Making coffee at dawn, sitting in a chair that remembered the interviews I once gave, and watching light transform the wall where awards used to hang. The network that had once pulsed with gossip was quieter now, and my name began its slow, careful return into pages that mattered. I am not immune to irony. The same medium that amplified the lies became the vessel of their undoing. I used timelines, public posts, and the attention economy to reverse the narrative, a decision some call weaponizing the truth. But if weaponizing truth means bringing to light the people who build false altars of power, then perhaps it is a duty rather than a sin. I know the moral tightrope. Exposing wrongdoing can hurt innocents who are caught in the crossfire. Revenge can become indistinguishable from justice if you're not vigilant. Still, there is a particular sweetness in watching a rumor return to dust when held against a ledger of facts. This is my confession and my reclamation. A few years ago, a scandal ruined my career. I vanished from the media and worked in the shadows to gather what was hidden. Today I stand with an archive and testimonies that trace the origin of the rumor. I feel free, but the freedom carries a weight. The knowledge that truth, once released, reshapes lives in ways both healing and harsh. You might call what I did revenge. Others might call it restitution. I call it a refusal to be erased. Would you have taken the same road? What would you have done in my place? Is this justice, or is it simply another kind of violence? They thought my first statement was the full story, but that was only the opening move. The truth is, what I revealed publicly was just a fraction of what I had gathered. My enemies were already scrambling, issuing carefully worded denials, commissioning spin articles, and pushing hashtags that tried to paint me as bitter, obsessed, or irrelevant. But they didn't understand. I had anticipated every move. I had studied their patterns the way a hunter studies the habits of prey. Behind the curtains, I was building something bigger. Think of it as an archive, but really it was a labyrinth. I didn't want to just prove that they had lied about me. I wanted to dismantle the entire machinery that made the smear possible in the first place. If I only cleared my own name, they could easily target someone else next week. And that was the thought that kept me awake at night. How many other careers had they quietly destroyed with the same tricks? My backstory wasn't just about betrayal. It was about complicity. I had once sat in meetings where I saw other people disappear. A journalist who asked too many questions suddenly had a scandal about misused funds. An activist who criticized corporate donations mysteriously found their emails leaked with damaging edits. At the time, I told myself it wasn't my fight. I was too focused on protecting my own trajectory. But when it was my turn, when I became the target, I understood how systematic it all was. My revenge, then, wasn't just personal. It was structural. I began with timelines. Every rumor about me, every article, every tweet that had gone viral, I mapped them out on a massive digital wall. Red strings connected timestamps, IP addresses, publishing patterns. What looked chaotic at first began to crystallize into shapes. The same 3 accounts always tweeted within seconds of each other. The same blog that broke the story about me had a registered owner linked to an executive's nephew. And those anonymous leaks. They all originated from the same office Wi-Fi, conveniently the same floor where my so-called friends used to sit. Dramatic pause. Imagine the feeling of realizing that the people you once had drinks with on Friday nights were logging into burner accounts to destroy you. That sting, half betrayal, half absurd comedy, made me laugh out loud in the middle of the night. Revenge is bitter, but irony? Irony is delicious. My plan deepened. I wasn't going to dump all of this at once. I wanted to break them apart piece by piece, like watching cracks spread through glass before it shatters. So I started staging leaks. The first was subtle. I gave a sympathetic journalist access to one internal email thread where executives discussed how to frame the scandal after it went public. That email alone was enough to make one mid-level manager panic and resign. He thought he was saving himself. In truth, he was just the first domino. Next, I targeted the social media machinery. Those independent bloggers who amplified lies about me. I traced payment invoices to a PR subcontractor that specialized in reputation demolition. I released the invoices anonymously to an investigative outlet. The headline the next morning was a thing of beauty: reputation hit squad paid to plant fake stories. My name wasn't even in the article, but everyone who knew the backstory could connect the dots. Suddenly, their denial strategy collapsed. They weren't just fighting me, they were fighting public disgust at their whole operation. But I wasn't finished. Oh no! The real masterpiece was in the testimonies. Remember the assistant who kept those printed memos? She wasn't the only one. Over months, I carefully contacted others. Interns, freelancers, even cleaning staff who had overheard too much. Some ignored me, others blocked me. But a handful were ready to talk. They had seen the machine from the inside, and now that cracks were showing, they smelled weakness. I offered them anonymity, protection, and in return, their words became daggers. One by one, they confirmed details that only insiders could know: who ordered the leaks, who signed off on the smear fund, who pushed the fake narratives. The dramatic irony? Many of these people had been dismissed as irrelevant by the very executives who depended on their silence. The receptionist they mocked, the intern they overworked, they became my allies. Revenge isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about patience, about listening to those everyone else ignores. The climax of this stage came during a live broadcast panel. One of my main accusers, a polished executive with a perfect smile, sat confidently, ready to repeat his rehearsed lines. What he didn't know was that I had already leaked audio of him bragging about killing careers for sport to a group of investors. The clip went viral seconds before he went on air. Watching his face as the interviewer asked, "Do you deny this is your voice?" was like watching a tower collapse in slow motion. He stammered, he sweated, he looked left and right as though someone would save him. No one did. His fall was public, humiliating, and irreversible. And yet, the satisfaction wasn't just in the exposure. It was in the silence that followed. The silence of all those who had once joined the chorus of lies, now too scared to speak. The silence of former friends, who didn't know how to look me in the eye. The silence of the machine, broken and sputtering. That silence was my music. The consequences rolled out like aftershocks. Lawsuits were filed, executives suspended, PR firms blacklisted. And me. I didn't declare victory. I stayed quiet, calm, and let the chaos swirl. People begged me for interviews, for statements, for exclusive access. I refused. Because the most powerful revenge wasn't screaming my innocence, it was letting their guilt scream for itself. But revenge is addictive, isn't it? Once you've tasted the balance of the scales, you start wondering how far justice can go. I had cleared my name, yes. But I had more evidence, more testimonies, more skeletons locked in closets. The question wasn't whether I could bury them further. The question was, should I? Because now, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was holding proof that this wasn't a one-time smear, but a repeated, calculated system. And if I unleashed everything, it wouldn't just end their careers. It could topple entire networks, destroy reputations that stretched far beyond my little scandal. Was I ready to become the executioner, or should I stop at vindication? That's the crossroads where I stand now. Would you stop once your own name was cleared? Or would you go further, and burn down the whole rotten house? The third act begins in daylight, not at midnight. After the first and second waves of exposure, the battlefield shifted from public feeds to corridors of power. The boardrooms closed, lawyers sharpened their pens, and the quiet, efficient men who orchestrated damage control turned their attention to containment. I had rattled the cage. Now they wanted to silence the noise and bury what remained. That was when I realized my war had changed shape, from proving my innocence to deciding the kind of world I wanted my truth to build. Backstory matters here because the roots of this conflict go deeper than one scandal. Earlier, when I still believed in institutions, I'd trusted committees and compliance reports to do the right thing. I'd given people the benefit of the doubt. That faith, naive as it was, taught me their language: legalese, audit trails, corporation speak. I used that language as a weapon. If they built walls with contracts and NDAs, I would chip at mortar with forensic precision. If they buried evidence in encrypted folders, I would teach investigators how to find the crumbs they left behind. Revenge, I learned, is as much pedagogy as performance. You must show the world how to see what was hidden. Development of this phase required allies with different currencies. A seasoned investigator with a disdain for PR spin, a data scientist who could model social contagions, and a lawyer who understood that sometimes precedent must be pushed. We mapped not just documents but ecosystems. Funding flows, friendly non-profits that laundered narratives, and charitable arms that served as rumor dispensers. My notes filled with phrases like ghost accounts, circular payments, and influence adjacency. I stopped thinking of people as isolated actors and began to see them as nodes in a network designed to shield each other. The deeper we probed, the more beautiful and terrifying the design became. Dramatic pauses were built into our strategy deliberately. We held back certain exculpatory materials, not out of malice but to force procedural breaks, to make their counsel spend resources, to make their spokespeople contradict themselves under pressure. We released a report linking a foundation to covert spending on smear campaigns, then waited as they countered with legal threats. Those threats became evidence of intent, a pattern of intimidation that only confirmed our thesis. In the quiet that followed each release, we watched for movement, resignations, internal purges, whispered apologies. Those small tremors signaled larger fault lines. The mid-game required psychological finesse. I started meeting people who had been casualties of similar schemes: a journalist blacklisted after questioning a donor, a non-profit director who found their emails edited to look like embezzlement. Their testimonies were raw, itchy with the need for reparation. I offered them structure and strategy instead of therapy. A platform, legal counsel, and the promise that their stories would be heard in a way that could not be easily gaslit. They were cautious at first. Why trust the person who had been erased? But trust is a currency earned through consistency. I showed up. I listened. I turned fragments into narratives that respected their dignity. Then came the betrayal I had not predicted. One of my closest confidants, the data scientist who had built our network visualizations, vanished overnight. His workstation wiped. His accounts archived. At first we assumed he had been scared into silence. But then he appeared in a puff-piece interview on an outlet we had once considered friendly, painting me as obsessive and suggesting my evidence had been fabricated. The article read like a paid hit disguised as concern. The man who had mapped our enemies had mapped me instead. I felt the familiar cold. The knives had been polished from within. Rage flared, but it was tempered by suspicion and calculation. Whoever turned him had leverage, possibly threats to his family, a payoff, or something worse. I needed to know which. The development pivoted. We shifted from offense to recovery. The lawyer filed a motion to compel metadata. The investigator traced the smear to an offshore consultancy famous for reputation laundering. The data scientist's contradictions crumbled when we produced a cache of version files showing his hands on the original models. He had been coerced, after all. The payoff was a manipulated account designed to fracture our coalition. The hurt was personal, the humiliation sharp, but the resolution was instructive. Power often wins through the small cruelties, the threats to the people you love. Revenge that ignores grief is hollow. Revenge that learns from pain grows tactical maturity. The climax of this part is less a single explosive moment and more a threaded, relentless unmasking. We scheduled a private hearing where board members who had hidden behind lawyers were forced to answer under oath. It was not televised, but snippets leaked, because not every victory needs an audience. One director, who had smiled at my fall and collected bonuses while my career burned, was asked a single question by our investigator. "Did you authorize payments to third parties for online influence?" He hesitated, fingers trembling on the table, then muttered something about market testing. That mutter became a confession when auditors produced bank transfers with memos matching the dates of the original smear. The room exhaled like a released bellows. The director's posture collapsed as if reeds had given way. There was a cinematic irony in watching them scramble to salvage reputations with pallid op-eds and statements that now read like afterthoughts. They had spent years polishing images while manufacturing chaos. Now their statements were brittle, like cheap lacquer, and people saw through them. The media ecosystem that once cheered on scandal for clicks began to pivot. Investigative outlets that had previously been cowed now amplified our findings. The narrative shifted from fallen star to engineered ruin, and with that shift came a deeper cultural anger. Audiences began to ask who else had been smeared and why. My personal vindication widened into a public reckoning. The aftermath of this stage was complex. Regulatory bodies launched inquiries. Foundations froze funds pending review. Some of my old allies, who had kept distance during the initial storm, returned with cautious hands and contrite faces. Others who had been complicit stood on the edge of the abyss, bargaining for minimal consequences. I negotiated like a surgeon. I wanted changes that would prevent future smears, transparency protocols, oversight committees, and whistleblower protections. Revenge had taught me that restitution is incomplete without structural repair. Yet the emotional residue remained. There were nights when the quiet felt like a verdict that had not allowed for mourning. The loss of time, trust, and opportunities did not vanish because the papers printed corrections. My sense of self had been edited and reprinted. No apology could stitch the holes left in years. Part of me wanted to wield the remaining evidence as a cudgel, to break the careers of every person who had smiled at my ruin. Another part, the quieter, wiser part that had watched accomplices become targets and targets become accomplices, urged restraint. Justice should improve the world, not merely satisfy a hunger for domination. So I chose balance. I pushed for reforms, supported the whistleblowers, and kept some proofs for legal channels to ensure accountability. I refused, deliberately, to be the person who took pleasure in total annihilation. There is a line between retribution and justice. I wanted to walk it, not stomp it into oblivion. Still, there are moments when the temptation to unleash everything still whispers in the margins. Old photographs, emails that read like confessions, they sit in my archive like sleeping animals. I visit them sometimes, not to feed the beast, but to remind myself why I started down this path, to strip away the machinery that chews through lives. This part ends not with a triumphant roar but with a decision. I could continue to unravel the network until every name lay bare, or I could use what I had uncovered to construct protections that made smears harder to execute. I chose the latter, for now. Because true revenge, I decided, must be accountable to the future it creates. You can destroy those who hurt you, but you also have the power to ensure they cannot hurt others in the same way. So tell me, if you held the map to a machine that ruins lives, would you burn it to ashes, or would you use it to build locks and alarms? Which is truer revenge? The collapse of your enemies, or the prevention of future victims? They thought the story would end with my silence, but silence, I learned, can be louder than any scream. The fourth part opens in the aftermath, where the dust has settled into new patterns and the real work begins. Repair, reinvention, and the quiet cruelty of consequences. After toppling a few primes and forcing reforms, I discovered something unsettling. Dismantling a machine doesn't automatically heal the people it chewed up. There are collateral scars. Careers stalled, relationships strained, reputations that take longer to mend than dismantling took. I had wanted to build a barricade against future smears, but I also wanted to make sure the people trampled in the process found footing again. The honesty of that desire surprised me. Revenge had become stewardship. Backstory here is short but necessary. Once, before the scandal, my life was measured in meetings and milestones, in small gestures of recognition that compounded into prestige. That world was not innocent. It had inequities and quiet cruelties. But it also contained allies whose faith had been real. In the initial fury, I focused on unmasking those who engineered my fall. Now, I turned my attention to the aftermath, to the networks of support I could rebuild and the systems I could change so others would not be left to pick through ruins alone. It felt less glamorous than public spectacle, but more consequential. Development of this phase required a different toolkit. Performance had given way to policy. I convened roundtables with journalists, legal advocates, and former insiders who had chosen the light rather than the dark. We drafted guidelines for ethical reporting on allegations, advocated for mandatory provenance checks on leaked materials, and proposed funding transparency for third-party PR contractors. I learned how to lobby without theatrics. Persistent emails, strategic meetings, quietly leveraging sympathetic board members who still believed institutions could be reformed. I also built support networks for those who had been targeted, pro bono legal clinics, therapy stipends, and small grants to help rebuild professional portfolios. Some of this work was tedious. Paperwork has a way of testing commitment. But it was necessary. If smearmakers were to be deterred, the ecosystem had to be less hospitable to their tactics. Dramatic pauses appeared in the rhythm of our advocacy, moments where progress stalled and I had to resist the urge to force spectacle. One victory felt small but vital. A newsroom agreed to adopt a two-source plus verification policy for explosive allegations, refusing to run a rumor without independent corroboration. It was not headline-grabbing, but it breathed life into the idea that truth could be engineered into practice. Another pause was cruel. A whistleblower we had defended faced renewed threats. Seeing the terror in their messages, the late-night panic in a voice that had once been brave, brought me back to the rawness of why I had started. Revenge that ignores the human cost is vanity. Revenge that protects the vulnerable is labor. The emotional texture of this phase was complicated. Some days I felt saintly, as if working for restitution validated every sacrifice. Other days I felt animalistic, remembering how pleasurable it had been to watch a liar stumble on camera. Reconciling these impulses required candid conversations with allies and the small, private rituals that kept me steady. Revisiting the names of people who had helped me, reading their testimonies aloud, and writing letters I never sent to those who had betrayed me. There is a peculiar humility in rebuilding. You realize power is temporary, relationships are delicate, and the urge to dominate can corrupt even righteous aims. I tried to shelter the work from my ego. The climax of this part is quieter than the previous ones, but perhaps more durable. After months of advocacy, a coalition of newsrooms, legal clinics, and civil society groups announced a framework for accountability in media-related smear campaigns. It included a public registry of PR subcontractors who worked on reputation campaigns, a whistleblower protection statute for journalists and staff, and a rapid response team to verify or debunk viral allegations within 48 hours. The announcement didn't topple anyone instantly. It didn't need to. It changed incentives. Smear merchants found fewer buyers for their services, and institutions that had outsourced moral choices into anonymous vendors had to reckon with exposure. Watching that coalition sign its name to commitments felt like planting trees whose shade I might never sit under. The true thrill was not in the applause but in the knowledge that, carefully, the landscape had shifted. Yet consequences lingered. Some of those who aided my exposure repented sincerely and offered to help build these systems. Others pivoted into denial and obstruction, quietly funneling resources back into the same obfuscation networks. I realized that transformation would be iterative, punctuated by attempts at sabotage. We had to be vigilant. There were nights I would wake to messages, another smear attempt, another attempted leak. My inbox became a battleground of prevention rather than retribution. I hired volunteers to monitor suspicious payments, trained a small legal team to file injunctions, and cultivated a roster of sympathetic editors ready to verify claims. The infrastructure of defense was as much a part of the revenge as the original exposure, a paradox I embraced. The personal arc continued, too. My relationships remained a mosaic of repair and rupture. Old friends returned with tentative warmth, some with guilt that weighed them down. Family gatherings were awkward, threaded with the knowledge that my life had been aired in ways neither of us wanted. I sought therapy, partly to manage anxiety, partly to learn how to forgive myself for the things I had enjoyed in those darker moments. Forgiveness wasn't automatic. It was, like everything important, something to practice. I learned to hold contradictions, to acknowledge that I had derived satisfaction from seeing my enemies stumble, and to affirm that I would not be defined solely by that satisfaction. The ending of Part 4 is both pragmatic and unsettling. The frameworks we built created buffers, but they didn't eradicate the hunger for scandal. New methods surfaced. Smears adapted like viruses. I accepted that the work was ongoing, a lifelong vigilance rather than a final victory lap. But there was a different quality to the vigilance now. Less personal hunger, more stewardship. I had traded the joy of revenge for the responsibility of repair. That trade cost me some immediacy and gave me durability. Finally, I offer this to you, the viewer. Revenge can feed you for a while, but stewardship feeds futures. I could have continued to feed the spectacle, to become a perpetual avenger turning secrets into shows. Instead, I chose to turn evidence into armor for others. The question at the end of this stage is not about getting even. It's about what you do when the fury subsides and the real work remains. Would you use your victory to build protections for the next person, or would you keep the weapon for yourself, waiting for the next betrayal? Which would feel truer in your hands? The thrill of watching a tower fall, or the slow work of nailing new foundations in place? They said revenge would leave me empty, but I've never felt more complete. Part 5 is the final act, the moment where threads converge and the story finds its rhythm in aftermath, reflection, and the quiet pulse of legacy. I've walked through fire, rebuilt from ashes, and stood in rooms where the same people who once plotted my erasure now stumble through apologies and excuses. The question is no longer whether I won. The question is what kind of person emerges from a war fought with lies, truth, and time. The backstory that haunted me for years now feels almost like someone else's nightmare. That scandal, the one engineered with precision, amplified with malice, and sharpened by betrayal, no longer defines me. I am not the victim they thought they destroyed. I am not even just the avenger who brought them down. I have become something stranger, both architect and archaeologist, building new structures while digging through ruins to show others where the foundations failed. My revenge, once personal and sharp, has widened into something systemic and enduring. Development of this final stage was paradoxical. On the surface, the battles were done. Investigations had concluded, resignations had piled up, reforms had been signed. My name, once synonymous with scandal, was now linked with resilience and exposure. Journalists called me a case study, activists asked me to speak about disinformation, and young professionals whispered that my fight gave them courage. Yet beneath the surface, temptation lingered. I still had archives I never released, documents so damning they could ruin people forever. And some nights, staring at those files, I felt the hunger rise again. Why not finish them? Why not salt the earth so nothing of their empire could regrow? Here, dramatic pauses carried more weight than action. I sat in boardrooms and listened to people argue about codes of ethics. I walked past buildings where I had once been celebrated and then erased. I heard apologies from lips that still tasted of insincerity. And every time I felt the urge to detonate the rest of my evidence, I paused and asked myself, would this make the world better, or would it just feed my anger? Revenge had taught me to savor patience, but it had also taught me restraint. To unleash everything might feel satisfying, but it would trap me in the same cycle I had spent years breaking. The climax of this stage was not a scandalous reveal, not another broadcast. It was quieter and, in its own way, more devastating. I gathered the remaining evidence, the emails, the payments, the audio files, and I sealed them into an encrypted archive. Then I deposited it, not with the press, but with a trusted consortium of investigators and archivists who specialize in corruption cases. My condition was clear: release the archive only if the machine reactivates, if the smear merchants rebuild their empire. Until then, it remains dormant, like a blade sheathed in glass. This act was my final stroke of revenge, not in destruction, but in control. They know I have it. They know it exists. That knowledge alone is a leash they can never escape. And so, the real consequences began. Some of my enemies live in exile, reputations fractured beyond repair. Others still hold positions, but with clipped wings, forever shadowed by the possibility that the archive could surface. Every decision they make is haunted by the question, what if this wakes the beast again? That uncertainty is my victory, Because revenge is not always about the strike. Sometimes it's about leaving your enemies to walk on glass, forever aware that one wrong step could open old wounds. The aftermath for me has been both liberating and complex. My career didn't return in the same form. It evolved. I no longer chased the same validation I once craved from headlines or titles. Instead, I built new spaces, advocacy projects, mentorship networks, creative outlets where truth isn't manipulated for profit. I found power in helping others navigate storms like mine, arming them with the strategies I had forged in battle. Every time I guide someone through their own smear attempt, I taste a different kind of satisfaction. One less bitter, more sustaining. But here's the irony. Revenge never really ends. It doesn't vanish after the climactic moment. It lingers like a scar, a reminder etched into identity. Sometimes, in quiet hours, I replay the downfall of my enemies in my head, the way one replays a favorite scene in a film. The satisfaction is real, and so is the weight. I will always be the person who chose to fight back, who turned lies into weapons of truth, who refused to be erased. That identity comes with responsibility, whether I like it or not. The finale of this story, then, is about legacy. I am free, yes. Free from the cage they built, free from the smear that once defined me. But I also carry a sword, hidden but present, a promise that the machinery of lies cannot spin unchecked again. In this way, revenge has become not just my closure, but my mission. And perhaps that is the truest form of justice. Not burning everything down, but ensuring that if fire returns, I hold the extinguisher and the match. So here I stand, not triumphant in the cinematic sense, but resolved in the quiet sense. I am not asking for applause or sympathy. I am asking a question, the same one that has haunted me since the beginning. Would you stop once you had destroyed those who wronged you, or would you build a world where their tricks no longer worked? If you were me, would you keep the sword sheathed, waiting, or would you let it swing one final time? And tell me honestly, after everything they did, after the lies and betrayals, after years of exile and rage, would you have shown them mercy? Or would you have burned the house to the ground?